Okay, so the walls of Jericho, they've come tumbling down. But believe me, the real fight for the Promised Land is just getting started. Today we're going to dive into the second half of the story, a gripping account of military strategy, divine miracles, and some of the toughest ethical questions in the entire Old Testament.
So, what does it really take to conquer a land? I mean, you're probably thinking armies, right? Strategy, superior weapons. But for ancient Israel, the story is so much deeper than that.
You see, for them, this wasn't just some military campaign. Nope. The whole thing, the entire conquest, was tied to a promise, a covenant with God that set the terms for everything that was about to happen. All right, so let's jump right in, and we're not going to start with a battle. Instead, we're looking at this really crucial ceremony that happens right after their first big wins. So Joshua gets all the people together, right between these two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and he reads the entire Law of Moses out loud. It's this powerful moment that's basically saying, hey, everybody, remember the deal. Obedience to God will bring blessing in this land, but disobedience, that will bring curses. The conditions for possessing the land are made crystal clear before the real campaign even gets rolling.
Okay, so everyone knows the stakes, and the Southern campaign kicks off, but not with some big frontal assault. It starts with a clever and, pretty complicated little twist.
The people of Gibeon, who lived just down the road, knew they were next. So what do? They stage this elaborate deception. They show up looking like they've been traveling for months, and they ask for a peace treaty. And here's the critical error. The Israelite leaders make the deal without consulting God. They swear an oath in God's name, and once that's done, it's binding. When they discover the lie just 3 days later, they can't go back on their word. And this one single mistake, ironically, is what triggers the entire Southern campaign.
And because of that treaty, when 5 local kings team up to attack Gibeon for siding with Israel, Joshua is obligated to defend them. And this is what leads to one of the most famous and maybe most debated miracles in the entire Old Testament. Right in the middle of the battle, Joshua prays this incredible prayer. The text says the sun literally stopped in the sky for about a full day, giving Israel all the light they needed to win a decisive victory. So the big question is, what actually happened here?
So how do we interpret this? Well, as you can see, there are basically 3 main perspectives. Some see it as a rationalistic legend, an inspiring but non-historical story. Others think it's poetic expression, using figurative language to describe an incredibly effective, supernaturally charged battle. And a third view holds that it was a literal event, a genuine miracle, though just how it happened is up for debate. But here's the thing, no matter which interpretation you lean towards, the theological point of the story is the same. God directly intervened to fight for Israel.
Okay, let's shift gears and head to the Northern campaign. We're going to see a similar theme play out here, but with a totally different challenge.
Up north, Israel faced this massive coalition of kings. And this army wasn't just big, it was technologically superior. They had horses and iron chariots. We're talking about the ancient equivalent of a tank division. But God gives Joshua a very specific and kind of strange command.
And God's command here just brilliantly illustrates the core lesson, which you can see laid out right here. On one side, you've got trust in military might, relying on horses and chariots, doing things the way of the nations. On the other side, trust in the Lord. God's command to hamstring the horses and burn the chariots was a clear test. Would Israel adopt the world's methods for security, or would they trust in him alone? And Joshua obeys, completely, demonstrating that their real reliance was on God, not on weapons.
After these victories, we get to what is, without a doubt, the most ethically challenging part of the entire story, the command to completely destroy the inhabitants of the land.
The Hebrew word for this is Herem. It refers to devoting something or someone to God for total destruction. And let's be honest, for many of us reading this today, this is deeply troubling. How do we even begin to make sense of this?
Well, the source material frames this command by pointing way back, hundreds of years earlier to this verse in Genesis. The idea is that God actually delayed this moment for centuries, but the time had come when the wickedness of the Canaanite cultures was considered full. The conquest then is portrayed not as an act of aggressive war, but as carrying out a long-delayed divine judgment.
So it's crucial to make a distinction, and this slide really lays it out. We often hear the term holy war, which implies human-initiated aggression. But the Bible never actually uses that term for this conflict. A more accurate concept is a Yahweh war, a war initiated and directed by God himself. In this view, Israel is acting as the instrument of divine judgment, not fighting for their own self-interest.
This leads to a key theological framework for understanding the conquest. It's seen as an act of anticipated eschatology. Now, that's a fancy term, I know, but it's just a way of saying it was a unique, one-time historical event that served as a preview of God's final, ultimate judgment on evil. It wasn't meant to be a model for all future warfare, but a specific, limited picture of a future reality.
So this brings us to the end of the campaign, where the land is conquered but not yet fully settled. And that leads to one last apparent contradiction.
Okay, so the text says in chapter 11 that Joshua took the entire land. But then just 2 chapters later, God tells an aging Joshua that there are still very large areas of land to be taken over. So which one is it?
The explanation is a 2-stage conquest. Think of it this way. Joshua's swift campaigns were like the initial invasion. He broke the back of all organized military resistance. That was stage 1. But stage 2 was the long, hard work of each individual tribe moving into their allotted territory and fully possessing it, a job that, as the book of Judges shows us, they didn't always complete.
And it all culminates right here, in Joshua's final address. After all the battles and the division of the land, he brings the whole nation back to the core choice. The land was a gift, but possessing it fully required a daily decision of allegiance. His famous declaration, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord," becomes the ultimate challenge, a question that echoes far beyond ancient Canaan and right down to us today. Who will you serve?